August 1959. Fresh from the stage, a black musician exits the Birdland nightclub, New York City. Next to him, Judy, a curvaceous and beautiful white woman, is escorted to an awaiting taxicab. After a few brief moments of exchange well wishes, the musician says his goodbyes for the night as the cab carries Judy to her destination. In an attempt to clear his head before the next set, the musician stands in front of the marquee and lights a cigarette. Seconds later, a beat cop approaches the musician and commands him to move along. The musician refuses, points to the marquee, which has his name in lights, and makes a brief attempt at explaining to the officer that he is the headliner. Whether ignorant or indifferent, the officer again commands the musician to move along, but this time, after a short staring contest, the musician becomes defiant. The officer reaches for his baton, and before the musician or any of the onlookers could stop the commotion, another white detective, unseen by anyone, clubs him over the head, and the two officers beat him mercilessly before taking him to the precinct for booking. Weeks prior, unbeknownst to them, the musician had released his seminal new album under Columbia Records, an album that would define a generation and catapult him to legendary status. The album was Kind of Blue. The musician was Miles Davis. And by the next morning, after the press was notified and Miles was released from police custody, still in his blood-soaked khaki suit, the world of jazz and Miles would never be the same again. Welcome to the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast, episode 7. Welcome to the 7th episode of the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast. I am your host, Andre. Today, we're going to discuss the idea of reinvention and as it pertains to Miles Davis, but this is definitely applicable in all of our lives. To kind of get to the point, Miles Davis was born on May the 26th, 1926, in Alton, Illinois. Unlike most African Americans of the time, Miles Davis grew up wealthy. His father was a well-known and respected surgical dentist. This provided the family with a substantial income. In fact, his father was the second richest man in Illinois by the time Miles was 13. And it was at that same age that Miles received his first trumpet. Although his mother wanted him to play the violin, his father insisted, and Miles was given the trumpet. And even as a child, he had sort of a tendency to sort of see things differently. There were stories of him going to the forest and listening to the birds and the insects and trying to play the trumpet along with the animals because he saw these things or heard these things as music. And he sort of put all of his energy into learning the trumpet and all of the intricacies of it. So much so that by the time he was 15, he was actually promoted to the musical director of the entire band. And over time and over travels, he got to meet a lot of his contemporaries. This included Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, or Bird, as they called him. And they influenced him. They influenced him to seek more, to do more, and to go to places that included the people that were pursuing the same thing that he was pursuing, which was music. This wasn't really a hard decision. At this point in his life, his family was a little bit turbulent. His father was abusive to his mother, and this did totally impact Miles Davis's sort of view on marriage and life and even women. In fact, his father hit his mother so hard one time that he knocked out her front teeth. This impacted him because Miles actually saw this, of course, and he witnessed this, and it gave him a viewpoint on marriage that was not always healthy. Nevertheless, by the time he was 18, he did move to New York and he enrolled in the Juilliard School for about a year and a half. He felt that the training was more geared towards a more strict, or as he put it, a more white way of doing music. Now, you have to remember at this time, New York was bustling with artists and writers, and in his particular case, 52nd Street was the hub of jazz music. In fact, there was a jazz club across the street from either club that was on the street. And I know I said that in a weird way, but on either side of the street, there was a jazz club that you could go into, that you could learn from, and if you were good enough, they would let you get on stage. And that was the case with Miles. Also, what was the case over the hours and the days and the months that he performed with these different musicians, he developed his own style. It's actually called a straight tone. At the time, bebop was the more popular form of jazz, although at the time it was considered strange music. It's so odd to hear that now, but at the time, jazz was considered a strange music that was sort of like a backdrop or a soundtrack to criminal behavior and promiscuity and things of that nature. But in that time, Miles developed his own style of music. Later, he linked up with a fellow by the name of Gil Evans, who's primarily known for the fact that they did record about 3 albums together. But the thing about Gil that was different was that Gil taught Miles a different way of interpreting sound. Again, you must understand that at that time, Black music was more of a minstrel sort of activity, and it was pulling away from that. It was reaching its point of art, and Gil was sort of the catalyst that allowed Miles to explore that part of his psyche. Now, in 1949, Miles went to Paris to perform, and while he was in Paris, he hung out with Picasso and all of these different sort of prominent people of the art scene, because at the time, jazz was seen as more of an intellectual endeavor. So he got respect from artists of different crafts because they saw his craft as just as elite as theirs. So he got to be around people who didn't see him as a color, but saw him as a colleague. And it was very different for him, and it was encouraging to him. And it actually gave him a form of happiness that he thought wasn't attainable. But the only problem was this happiness was attained in a different country. And while he was in Paris, he had brief affairs with different women. He learned a lot. He explored a lot as far as music is concerned. And unfortunately, he did need to return back to New York. After all, at this point, he did have 2 children with his girlfriend. He did have obligations, and he did need to come back. Now, after flying back to New York from Paris, the weight of America sort of hit him immediately. And sometimes it's hard to describe that weight to people who don't understand it, but for those of you who do, you do understand. Now with Miles, this basically pulled him into a deep depression. And this is when he started experimenting with drugs, particularly heroin. At the time, of course, heroin was somewhat of a prerequisite for all jazz musicians. It was the downfall of most of them at the time. I think some of you listening, you know that Charlie Parker died at 34 years old as a drug addict. John Coltrane, Miles Davis, multiple artists, unfortunately, they had a bout with heroin. In this case, unlike most people, Miles Davis had a family that would not allow that to sort of ruin him. So much so that when he was on stage performing one night in New York, His father walked into the club, snatched Miles right off the stage, left his trumpet right there, and took him back home to East St. Louis so that he could get clean. Of course, Miles was in the throes of what they like to call dope sick. But after about 8 days of wrestling and vomiting and being sick and being unable to rest, he actually kicked the habit. But now comes the point of reinvention. Miles was written off. In fact, most people didn't even know where he was. He disappeared one night in New York, and as far as they knew, he was gone. His return to the spotlight came in 1955 when he performed at the Newport Jazz Festival. Now, for those of you who do not know, the Newport Jazz Festival, it continues to this day, but it is more of the preeminent showcase for musicians. And at the time, a lot of executives from different labels would be in the audience. So you had a very good chance of furthering your career if you performed well. Now, the thing that made Miles stick out, and if you actually take the time to listen to his music, and I hope that most of you do, the thing that made him stand out was that this was the first time that people could listen to an artist, particularly a jazz artist, and you could make love to his music. You could meditate to his music. You can kind of go within yourself and come out differently because it was almost a motor for thought, if that makes sense. Needless to say, after his performance, he was approached by several executives who wanted to sign him with their label. But the label with the sweetest offer, and actually the most tempting offer, was Columbia Records. Now, they did want to sign Miles, but there was a slight situation. He had a contract with a smaller label at the time that was entitled Prestige Records. And you can actually go back and find these records for yourself, and you can take a listen and kind of notice the difference in performance. But one of the stipulations of him signing with Columbia was that he had to get out of this deal with Prestige Records, but he owed them albums. So in order to actually do this, and this is a fact that I had to kind of double check myself, he actually recorded the equivalent of 4 albums in about 2 to 3 days so he could get out of his contract and then sign with Columbia Records. Now, it was around this time that Miles developed a growth on his larynx, and they had to perform surgery to remove it. It was non-cancerous, so the idea of it spreading wasn't a thought. It was just a question of removing this growth and him going back to his life as a trumpeter. The problem was that he didn't listen to the doctor's instructions. He was strictly forbade from speaking for 10 days. They told him not to speak for 10 days. Now, those who knew him, they knew that that was an impossibility, and he proved them right. And to the day that he died, because he chose to not listen to the doctor's instructions, that's where he got his somewhat identifiable rasp and sort of lowness to his voice. Because by speaking when it wasn't time to, he permanently damaged his throat. But yet and still, this was a time for reinvention. He emerged with his new quintet, and this was his first quintet. He had several famous quintets, but this is the classic with John Coltrane and McCoy Tyner and those particular artists. And that is when he recorded his most famous and most influential album, Kind of Blue. The interesting fact about this album was that there weren't actual notation for the artists to play off of. He came into the studio with brief sketches of what he wanted the music to be, and he allowed the artists to improvise their particular parts. And he was known for this. He was one, known for spotting talent, and he was second, known for letting younger artists or unknown artists sort of feel their way into the artist that they would become. And this came through improvisation. Once the album was released, it was an immediate hit. That's when he began to tour and go all over the world and sort of get his ego fed. And because of that, he picked up a few habits, and this included cocaine and alcohol and many other things. But at the same time, that's where he met the love of his life, a dancer by the name of Frances Taylor. Now, this is the longest relationship that Miles was ever in. She loved him deeply. He loved her the same. But at the time, fighting these demons, things became abusive. And she eventually did leave him. You have to remember, she was a known dancer. She wasn't just some woman that danced in the club. She traveled around the world. She's been through Europe. She's been all over the place, and many men wanted her, but she chose Miles. And unfortunately, his jealousy or his insecurity got the best of him, and he talked her into actually giving up dancing to just be his wife. In fact, at the time he even presented this proposition to her, she had just got a part on in the production of West Side Story, which was a life-changing job. But to sort of kowtow to his demand, she did actually quit. Subsequently, he brought his 3 children to live with him, and she had to learn to cook and clean and take care of him and his children. Now, there was an upside to this, I suppose. As I stated, Frances was a very beautiful woman. Miles Davis was the epitome of cool at the time. So anytime she was around him, they were dressed to the nines, they were driving Ferraris, and they were basically the talk of the town anywhere they went. But things went south. There was a story that she even tells that one night they met Quincy Jones and they had a brief conversation, nothing substantial, but just a brief conversation. And later on that night, she mentioned to Miles how handsome Quincy Jones was, and he lost it. He hit her in the face, knocked her out briefly. And when she came to, she sort of, in her heart, she hoped that that was the last instance, but that was not. And after years of abuse and sort of forgiving him, she finally left him. And this was one of the greatest regrets of his life. He always said that to the day that he died. But at the same time, he was stepping into his own, as a man, he sort of realized that with his looks and his skin tone, because Miles was a very dark skinned man, but he was also very handsome. And this was at a time where blackness was sort of seen as a liability, but because of his level of talent, it became an asset. He sort of stood out amongst a lot of people because of his talent and skin tone, and he used that to his advantage. So much so that for the next 10 or so years, he was the most popular artist in the country and in some parts of the world. But things change. And by the late 1960s and leading into the 70s, jazz was starting to wane. Rock and funk had started to slowly creep into the atmosphere and become the most saturated and beloved form of music at the time. But Miles didn't look at this as like an exit for his career. He looked at it as an opportunity. And what he did, which goes back to the line of reinventing yourself, he attached himself to different forms of music. And by different forms of music, I mean those actual musicians. He started bringing in electric guitars and he started bringing in sitars and all these different forms of music that enhanced what he did, but also kept him in the light. There's no better way to put it. And at this time, he was in his 40s and he came out with his album Bitches Brew, which was an immediate success. It sold around 500,000 copies. And even by today's standards, that's phenomenal. But back then, those were 500,000 physical copies. He performed at the Isle of Wight Festival in front of 500,000 people. He was at his highest point artistically that he'd ever been in. But at the same time, he still had his demons, and that was cocaine and milk and scotch. Those were his two vices that he often immersed himself in. And there was a brief period of time between 1975 to maybe 1981, 82, where he didn't play at all. He was sort of holed up in his New York apartment, kept it dark, kept most people out, did not touch his trumpet for the entire duration, and he sort of had to have a conversation with himself. And when he emerged from that conversation, he decided to give it a go again. And at this point, he had different women in his life that kind of taught him how to kind of be with the times. Because if you think about it, Miles was in his mid 40s when Bitches Brew came out. So by the time we're in the 80s, he's in his 50s. No one really cares whether he releases an album or not. But he jumps back into it. He comes back with that same effort, that same immense talent that he was known for. And he, once again, he reinvented himself. He started doing talk shows and TV shows. He was in an episode of Miami Vice. He performed with Prince and whomever. He had videos that were directed by Spike Lee. He sort of kept himself in line with the zeitgeist. And because he was willing to do that, to the point of sometimes even looking foolish, I'm not going to lie. Some of the outfits that he wore were questionable. The perm, it was questionable. The sunglasses, they were questionable. But this basically are the things that he did to keep himself challenged. And because he did that, he'll always be known as one of the great forefathers of modern jazz. You have to remember, in the context of jazz music, there's about 7 different kinds of jazz that he spearheaded. So keep in mind, over the course of a 50-year career, he managed to always keep himself challenged, keep himself going, and keep himself creative. He eventually started doing painting in his later years, and some of the pieces were being sold for $15,000-$20,000 at the time. I think now his paintings run north of $100,000 for some of them, but until his eventual death in 1991, he was always known, and he is always known as the man that changed everything in regard to modern jazz. But also, he was the embodiment of cool for at least 30 years. And that wasn't by accident. There were people that were in his life that were encouragement for this sort of change. And even within himself, there was an encouragement that he had to bring to actually make these things come to fruition. Miles Davis was not a nice man. He wasn't known for kindness. He wasn't known to make himself small, or as Toni Morrison once said, he wasn't willing to get on his knees to make someone feel tall. But within that came the ability to always, always be who he was. And the story that he often told himself was one of reinvention. And I encourage the listeners to have that same mentality and be mindful of the fact that you can reinvent yourself at any point in your life, whether you have 50 years left or 50 seconds left. You can kind of reach within yourself and begin again. Welcome back. Normally, as each episode has gone, I usually will kind of step in with a short story that somewhat has more of a tangible context with the first half of the episode, but I kind of didn't do it this week. There's no kind of about it. I didn't do it this week. And the reason I didn't do it was because I did want to kind of spend time, a little bit more time than normal, when it came to this particular story. And not because Miles was some particular juggernaut or anything of that nature. It's just because I kind of wanted to spend some time with the information that I got. And I'm encouraging all of you to not only listen to his music, but check out a few of the documentaries. There's footage of him performing in so many different places. And the difficulty, I should say, in this episode strictly came from the fact that Miles was not a particularly good guy. You know, he was abusive. He was a drug addict. He wasn't nice to most people. But the difference between Miles and a lot of people is that he dismissed himself from the idea of pretension. A lot of times people find themselves doing that because they want to get something from you or use you for something else. And Miles, because of his ability and because of his mind, that wasn't a necessity for him. And even if he felt like that needed to be the case, he just wouldn't do it. He wasn't that type of man. He had a strong self-belief. He had a lot of inner strength. And that's the well that he pulled on in times of need. And I believe that we all possess that well, but it's up to you to get the water, So I encourage you all to check out a movie. There was a movie by the name of Miles Ahead. I think it came out in around 2015, 2016. It was directed by Don Cheadle. It is not a biopic. It's more of a fictional biopic with vignettes and things that never actually happened, but it was meant to kind of give you an essence of the man. And even though it was chaotic, it's a good sort of piece to look at in regard to his life. So I encourage you guys to do that. Now, I will be back in about 2 weeks and we'll do everything as normal with the part A, part 2, or part A, part B, pardon me. But this week I kind of want to encourage you all plainly to look into the idea of reinventing yourselves. I know a lot of people that want to do other things other than what they're doing. And sometimes we feel like it's impossible. Sometimes we feel like that train has left the station. And I just want you all to know that sometimes you miss the train because you're supposed to walk. And I hope that makes sense. So I encourage you all to find the path, walk on that path, and just get where you need to go. Because the thing that you might be squeamish about, the thing that you kind of have a little bit of trepidation about, could be the very thing that frees you up. And could be the very thing that kind of ushers you into a new way of life. But in essence, that new way of life is the way of life that you were always meant to live. So with that, I want to bid you all adieu. As always, you can email me at swtomail@gmail.com. Feel free to leave a review. I need your feedback. I need to know that the things that I'm doing, they are affecting you. Please feel free to send me an email Do whatever or don't. Doesn't matter. I'm going to move forward either way, but I want to engage with you. I want you to know that I do listen to you, and in the future, I want to incorporate some of these emails that I've been getting into the episode. So until 2 weeks from now, I want you all to be mindful of the stories that you tell yourself. And I shall see you soon.